Hello and welcome to the Deduction, a Tax Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Hulehan, and today we are back with my co host, Erica York, and we are joined by Alex Durante, Senior Economist here at the Tax Foundation. Alex, it's really great to have you on the show.
Yep. Thanks for
Uh,
having me.
I've been hearing my entire life that Social Security is going to go bankrupt and that I can't count on it for my retirement and all of that. But I do want to start with the basics because I think that can get lost in the sauce here. So, how does Social Security work today? And, why is it like a central part of our retirement system?
Right. So you think of Social Security as a kind of income replacement program for retirees. So the way it works is that during your working years, you pay payroll taxes, which will show up on your tax forms as FICA taxes. You'll pay about 6.2% of your income to Social Security, and then the employer will kick in another 6.2%. So in total, you can think of it as about 12.4% of your wages and salaries are going into Social Security. Then when you retire, you are entitled under law to a monthly benefit. And the way that this is calculated is based on your average monthly earnings during your peak earning years. And then there's a benefit formula that's designed to replace a certain share of that income. Depending on where you are in the distribution of income, Social Security is either going to be replacing a very high share of your income or a smaller share. And that is how the system retains its progressivity. So for those at the bottom, it's replacing about 90% of your income. And as you go up to the taxable maximum, which is $169,000 for 24. Once you get past a certain threshold, it's going to be replacing a much smaller share of your income up to that maximum.
Alex, on that, I think a lot of people get confused and think, "Oh, I'm paying money in and then the government just holds it and then I'm getting my money back with some interest." What would you say about like that perception?
This is a great question because I myself have had this argument with my parents over the years where they're like, oh well, why should we cut Social Security or make any reform? I mean, I'm entitled to it. This is money I paid into the system. The reality is it's not that simple. So first, I mean, most retirees are going to be getting a much larger share than what they paid in. The average recipient is going to be receiving benefits about 35% higher than what they paid in. So it's not really the case that your money is just going into this this like particular account and is just earning interest. And the reason is that the money that is being paid out is actually being funded by current workers. So the funding the payouts are just totally contingent on having enough workers paying into the system. And once that breaks down, you can have a fiscal crisis, which is why there's been so much discussion around this because over the years, the worker per retiree ratio has declined substantially. So in 1960, which was about 20 years or so after Social Security issued its first payments, the worker to retiree issue was about 5 to 1. And it's steadily declined over the past several decades to 3 to 1. And over the next decade, it's actually scheduled to fall to 2 to 1. So you simply don't have enough workers paying into the system to fund current retirees, especially given that we have an aging population. We have the baby boomers retiring, and we also have fertility rates declining in the U.S. as well. So there's just a smaller share of people paying into the system. It's some other workers' money that's currently in the workforce that's paying into the system. I mean, you're getting your benefit is based on the contributions from those workers.
Yeah, and I think that that helps clear up why we hear so often that Social Security is going insolvent, those trends of workers to retirees and how that ratio has changed over time. But for people like us right now paying into the system who are going to retire in the future, what does that trend, that insolvency potential fewer workers, more retirees? What's that mean for folks?
So here's the state of play right now. By the end of 2034, the Social Security system, and that includes the old age program, the standard Social Security program, and the disability component, SSDI, those funds will be insolvent and only able to pay 83% of scheduled benefits. If you look at just the Social Security, the old age component, that will only be able to pay 79% of benefits by the end of 2032. Now, the two programs, in order to extend out that deadline, would have to actually be combined under law. Right now, they aren't. So we're really looking at the crisis coming ahead at the end of 2032. This actually leads to another sort of interesting discussion here because it's actually unclear if the benefits have to be cut across the board by 21% at the end of that year. There's a paper out by Andrew Biggs, who's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, that he co-authored and came to the conclusion that the president actually does have some considerable executive authority here to decide how the benefits could be cut. So it's entirely possible that on the eve of the faucet being depleted, that the president could simply say, well, we're going to protect all of the benefits for like a certain group in some part of distribution, say like the bottom half, and then we're going to concentrate the rest of the benefit cuts elsewhere. That seems to be something that the president could possibly do. Of course, it has to be done not in a discriminatory way. And I say this because I think if it was President Trump that were making this decision, I think we would probably see some real significant backlash to that. And of course, if this happens at all, we're going to see significant backlash anyway, because people in general don't like, again, they'll say that I'm entitled to my benefits. If the benefits have to be cut, why should we not all share in the burden? Why should it fall on this power distribution? That's really the crisis, what we're looking at. And what's interesting about this is that this is something that was entirely foreseeable by the actuaries.
This leads right into my next question, which is like, what do you see as the main drivers for these financial challenges with Social Security?
So I talk about this in my paper, and I think there is a simple fix. That now, of course, I say simple in the sense that I mean it is mathematically simple to do, but to pass any kind of reform through Congress, even though I'm going to propose here, would be a tall order. But the story is that back in the 1970s, inflation was very high, much like we experienced over the past few years. And Social Security was rapidly approaching insolvency even then, because there just were not enough payroll tax contributions to cover those promised benefits. So the idea was to come up with some kind of inflation indexed formula, so that benefits could be paid at a schedule that would be commensurate with the kind of revenue that was being brought in, at the time. And there was a commission that was assembled in Congress to review this, and there were two proposals that were considered. And this relates to how that initial formula, or how the initial benefit is calculated. So if you recall what I said earlier, the benefit that's paid is based on average indexed monthly earnings. So the question is, okay, indexed to what? So and these are the thresholds that are used to determine that initial benefit. So this is actually, so I just want to clear this up right here. So this is actually distinct from the cost of living adjustments that you often hear about, the so-called COLA adjustments. Those are adjustments that are made each year to account each year to the benefit that is paid out to account for inflation. But what I'm going to talk about is how that initial payment schedule is calculated. And what happened was in the 70s, they debated two issues. The two proposals were, one was to index these thresholds, which are called the bend points, for wages. And the idea was that as average wages grew in the economy, the amount of income that is replaced would be constant over that time horizon. And then as wages increase, you would continue to receive the same amount of your benefits but continue to be replaced over time. The other alternative that was considered was doing price indexing for those bend points, and that would just be indexing instead of indexing the thresholds to wages, you would index it to prices. So like the CPI or something.
Mhm.
Um, if they had done if they had chosen, so actually, well, I'll tell you what they chose. So they chose to index it to wages. Okay. And the problem with that is if you forecast that out many decades, and wages typically grow faster than prices over a longer time period, um, that one change right there is primarily the reason why Social Security faces deficits over the next 75 years. If they had chosen price indexing, I mean, we would have had a few years of deficits, but after about 2044, I believe, Social Security Trust Fund would have been an essentially permanent surplus. Now, so why did they not, okay, so this sounds great, but why was this not chosen? The Social Security Administration and Jimmy Carter and the unions, they wanted wage indexing, not only because it would promise workers a higher benefit over time, but they wanted Social Security as a share of their income to always be constant going forward. So that the government basically kind of always has the same stake in the welfare of its citizens over time. I think the problem with this argument is if you look at the data, I mean, Americans, they have been getting richer over time. I mean, incomes have been growing, despite what you may have heard. I mean, there has been income growth over the past, several decades, and it seems that if people's incomes are growing, that means they are able to save more. It's a personal choice, and if they're able to save more, does the government need to always have an equal share in their retirement? Perhaps not. And that is sort of why I think switching to price indexing makes for those bend points makes more sense than wage indexing.
And this is really interesting because I feel like there's all these little things that happen throughout history, throughout time, little decisions that you feel like are not the biggest thing in the world. It's like nobody honestly,
Right.
the regular average person is not consumer price index versus the wage increase. Like they're not into the weeds on that. But it is, I just think that that's a super fascinating how like little things in history can kind of really tilt things financially one way or the other. But I think you could almost see it as like and maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's sort of like a seesaw or something where it's like the weight on the retiree end just keeps getting heavier and heavier, and there's just not enough workers on the other side to bring it down to
Right.
level. Or kind of makes sense.
No, that's right, and it's interesting because the last time any kind of reform was being discussed in this way was back in 2013, where Obama appointed a bipartisan fiscal commission, and interestingly enough, I mean, proposal was not considered in their recommendations. But and I think their recommendations were good, by the way. And I discussed this in other forums as well. And usually the pushback I get is I think there's some concern that if we want to do any kind of trimming of benefits, you want to do this in the most progressive way possible. And some feel that switching to price indexing is not the most progressive way to do this. Now, I say this because um, President Bush in the early 2000s, they considered doing some form of say like progressive price indexing where where this change would maybe only be happening for like a certain part of the distribution, and that way you'd be trimming benefits um, more closer to the top and in the upper middle rather than across the distribution. I think doing that would be fine as well.
So we've seen a lot of proposed fixes out there from raising the retirement age to increasing taxes. Why has it been so hard for lawmakers to agree on a solution?
The critical issue, which is we don't simply have enough people paying in. I mean, there's also other ways that you could address that too, which is what this bipartisan Bull Simpson commission did recommend. And among those, was raising the retirement age by a couple of years. I mean, not right there. If they have them work a little bit longer, there's more people paying into the system. That kind of resolves that end of it. There was also proposal to switch to using a different price index for the cost of living adjustment. So instead of using the regular CPI, you would use the chained CPI, which better accounts for some consumer choices. That would also reduce benefits. And then finally, they had just proposed making the benefit formula even more progressive by replacing an even smaller share of wages as you get close to that taxable maximum. And then making and then after you do that, they had also proposed making the benefits a little bit more generous on the bottom end, but on net, it still worked out to on net being um a benefit cut. And I think doing all those would make sense and would have been sensible. If we adopted the recommendations, those proposals would not have restored permanent solvency of the system, but they would have at least restored solvency, within the next decade or so. Now, the one other pushback you do get with raising the retirement age is, it depends on where you look in the distribution, right? Because we know, there's been a lot of literature on this. We know that there are certain communities, in the U.S. There was the whole deaths of despair literature on this. That the life expectancy, say, in rural Appalachia is much lower than other parts of the country, and in particular for like working age men, that their life expectancies have not risen as sharply as other groups. Although even that is disputed. Let's just grant that perhaps there is something to this. There's a proposal out of Brookings by another scholar, Wendell Primus, I believe is how you say his name, and he actually was proposing um, doing an increase in the retirement age, but for different parts of the income distribution. So those so those in the upper middle class and closer to the top, they would be expected to work a little bit longer than those near the bottom of the income distribution. But that's like another way I think you can get at some of the objections that you have to doing this. And finally, I'll just say one more thing, because I've only been talking about the expenditure side. There are things you could do on the revenue side as well, as it relates to the payroll tax. And this was not something that was this specific proposal was not considered in the bipartisan commission report that I discussed. But one thing that you could do is subject larger shares of income to the payroll tax. And the way you would do this is, right now, a lot workers receive a lot of their income in these employment fringes, such as health insurance, right? And the employer-sponsored health insurance is currently exempt from the payroll tax. So if you were to apply the payroll tax to just that, for instance, that would expand the payroll tax base and also help to bring in some revenue. But that's another idea that I've written about, and that I know that Mark Goldwine, another scholar over at Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, has also been considering as of late. But I think that's another way on the revenue side in which you could generate improvements there.
So it sounds like we've got problems all around, whether it's the wage indexing and benefits like growing over time in real terms, fewer workers for the retirees we have now. But I'm pretty sure from your research, we're not the only country that has run into issues with its pension system. So what can we learn from the experience of other countries? What reforms make a lot of sense and could potentially, be adopted in the US?
So in my paper, I talk about 4 countries: Australia, Singapore, Chile, and Sweden. And I selected those 4 countries because one of the things I was discussing in my paper was, what can we do to reform Social Security? And again, this is very much like a pie in the sky kind of proposal. I selected these countries because they were countries that had these kinds of pay-as-you-go systems, pay-as-you-go defined benefit systems, which is what Social Security is. And they impart transition to some kind of defined contribution system, like the 401ks that we have with our employers, and that many others have. And the idea was having and in those systems, the difference is that they're fully funded because the money that you pay into it actually is going into an account, and that is your account. Not all. Now, I'm not going to go through all four of these countries because I think some are more useful for the American experience than others. So I am just going to briefly talk about just two, Sweden and Australia. Sweden is an interesting case because they had a system that was not unlike ours, and that was going bankrupt in the late '80s, early '90s for similar reasons. And what they did was they kept some kind of defined benefit pension, which to me I think makes sense because the one issue, and I hesitate to even say the word because it does sort of scare people. I could see Erica smile here, but as soon as you start to use the phrase, Social Security privatization, people immediately, um, people immediately, freak out when you say that and are repelled by that, and
Sounds scary.
yeah, and they think, okay, you're gonna subject my retirement income to the whims of the economy. That sounds really terrible, but I think there are ways that we could do this in efficacious fashion that could satisfy, I think, both sides of the aisle. And Sweden, what they sort of did here was they kept some kind of defined benefit pension, but they made it a flat benefit, and that flat benefit is really what you could think of as the safety net. That is for the workers, who maybe are not able to save as much, who maybe didn't save as much over their lifetime, but everyone in Sweden gets some kind of a flat benefit like that. And then they introduced these defined contribution accounts, which are not huge. I mean, you're only contributing a small share of your income into them, but they did attempt. My point in sharing Sweden is that they did attempt to introduce some kind of defined contribution scheme into their system as part of a reform, while still retaining some kind of defined benefit pension to ensure that there is some kind of floor there. And what's interesting about Australia is that they pretty much since 1993 have almost a purely privatized social security system that is very popular and generates very good returns for participants. And what's interesting in their program is that they do have. I mean, there are well, there's two things to point out. So much as I was saying before, there are certain limitations of what you can invest in, and it's actually the employer that selects the investment vehicles for the employees at the firm. And there's different investment funds that they can choose. One of the reasons that that I think a lot of taxpayers and individuals are sort of wary to contribute to or hesitant to save more is they might need access to the money for like a rainy day, right? They might need some kind of rainy day fund. If you put a lot of money in certain retirement accounts, and you withdraw too early, you're going to be facing tax penalties. And but of course, there's sort of a delicate balancing act you have to play here because you don't want workers to just be able to withdraw necessarily for any reason because they could do something irresponsible with the money, right? So the employer contributes. There's a mandatory contribution scheme, and you can contribute additional funds to those accounts as you wish. And for groups below a certain income threshold, the government will actually match those contributions. So there's incentive to actually contribute more. But what's interesting is that if you experience, say, some kind of severe financial hardship or some kind of medical episode, you actually can withdraw from those accounts before retirement for emergencies. And I think having that feature also encourages workers to contribute more, even beyond what their mandatory contributions require. And I think right now, I believe that for the Australian system, I believe it's 11.5%, that workers are required to contribute by law. I mean, they can take in additional contributions um, as they wish. So it's actually it's pretty close to what our contribution rates are. And again, I'm not saying that this is something we should wake up tomorrow and immediately transition to, but I don't see what's necessarily wrong with with even giving workers some some options to invest their money elsewhere, which is the proposal that was considered in the early 2000s. Bush's plan would have been an opt-in proposal. Now, of course, you also, I mean, the trick here is that if you have this opt-in proposal and then they opt in this not Social Security, that makes the insolvency crisis worse, right? So you really do have to fix that issue as well. And that's kind of why I was saying I like the idea that Sweden kind of has this hybrid system um that seems to work pretty well for
Yeah. I I really like the idea of Sweden, and it also gets at the bigger question of, like, what problem are we trying to solve? Should Social Security really be, like, the main thing people rely on for retirement, or should it be to prevent poverty
okay,
in retirement
okay.
and that minimum benefit?
Right. Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked this question because this is something that I wanted to get into a little bit, and it relates to another proposal for addressing this crisis that I didn't mention earlier. And this is one that you're kind of seeing come out of a lot of congressional Democrats, which is that, well, all we really have to do here is just increase payroll taxes to solve this funding gap. And one proposal that they have for doing that is to lift the payroll tax cap. So now all of your earnings above 169,000 will now be facing the payroll tax. So it is so look, it's true. That would definitely bring in revenues. There's no question about it. But it would not it would only solve about a third of the funding gap that we have. And again, that's the extreme example where we get rid of the cap. I mean, that's not even just like raising. I mean, that's just getting rid of it entirely. So that alone is not going to solve the funding issue. But to answer your question, so the issue with what makes me think this a little bit ironic is that the initial idea, as I've sort of been describing with Social Security, is that it really was intended to be this kind of universal program, and which means that the contributions were in some way supposed to be tied to the benefits that you receive. So if we have a system where we're taxing all of this income above the taxable maximum, but that we're not paying any benefits for that income to those households, then Social Security starts to look more like a so-called a welfare program, right? Which a lot of people that kind of scares a lot of people because traditionally, when you look at sort of polling and surveys on this, people really don't want anyone to touch your Social Security benefits. But if you have something called welfare, whether that's cash assistance or the food stamp program, as soon as people are like, oh well, we should definitely cut, we should definitely cut that, but not Social Security. So I think there's a concern that the program would become less popular if we kind of divorced the taxes from the benefits that are paid out. Now, my own view is that I don't think. I mean, I think, as you said, Erica, I think the purpose of Social Security should be to provide assistance to those who are unable to save for themselves, who are and who have not has not saved enough, maybe because they had some kind of financial hardship that they encountered in their lifetime. And I think that it's important to have some kind of minimum benefit and floor for those people. And I think that the current system that we have, I mean, as I was saying earlier, is just the idea is paying benefits to everyone. I mean, even millionaires are getting a Social Security check. I think if you poll people on that and said, should millionaires be getting? So I mean, both. I think people would probably say no, right? So I think, but again, this is a discussion that Republicans and Democrats need to have and think about what is the purpose of this program? Because I often hear like, oh, this is supposed to be some kind of insurance program, and I'm like, well, if it's an insurance program, this isn't really typically how insurance programs work, right? I mean, there's no like the formula is not based on any kind of like risk, like, oh, there's a risk that you might be, in poverty, when you hit this age. It's not. I think calling this a form of social insurance is kind of a misnomer. But I agree, and this is something that policymakers need to discuss and decide like what is the intention of this program. But I think as long as we're kind of tied to this view that the benefits should be universal, I think that is just really going to limit the kinds of sensible reforms that we can do.
That makes sense. And I'm gonna switch gears here because there's another thing we kind of have to hit on the Social Security topic that's really important and has been in the news on and off again. And I'd be curious to hear, honestly, both of your guys' perspective on it. Which is, one of Donald Trump's proposals and something he's talked about a lot is exempting Social Security from the income tax. And in a first glance, it sounds like a total win for my parents, probably all of your parents, and it sounds like it would be a great thing. Uh, would it be a great thing? Like, do we think that would really work? Would that make our problems worse? Would it make things better for retirees? How do you guys see this?
So there's a few problems. So first is that the taxes on Social Security benefits are used to fund not just Social Security, but Medicare as well, which is another program that's also facing insolvency. So if we exempt the benefits from taxation, that's actually going to accelerate the rate at which the trust fund for Social Security is depleted. So instead of expiring at the end of 2035, and that's again the whole program, old age program and disability, the deadline would move up 2 years, so the end of 2033. So it would make our fiscal crisis even worse. And then also the other issue is that logically it sort of doesn't make I mean logically I think if you exempted the benefits, it would kind of be favoring Social Security income over other types of income. So your contributions, my contributions, I'm paying tax on the employee side, but then the employer contributions are a deduction for them. They're deductible, right? And you can almost think of this as sort of like a 401k scheme, right? Where it's like my pre-tax contributions are deductible, and then when I withdraw, I'm paying taxes on those contributions. So it makes sense to tax a share of Social Security earnings when they're being, withdrawn, just to have parity, across those income streams, and that's what that is what the form. I mean, that is what it is designed, to do, is to achieve that. I will say, I think, I think a better alternative here, which makes more sense to me. So right now, the way that this is calculated is it's only a certain share of your benefits that are taxable, depending on where you are in the income distributions. They have these thresholds, and then above that, and then below that, none of your benefits are actually taxed. And then above that, I forget the exact. Eric, I don't know if you remember the exact income level. I think it's like 85.
There's like an 85% and a 50%.
Up to 85,000.
Yeah.
I think it's just a half of the benefits are included in taxable income, and then beyond that, it's 85% of the benefits. I think what would make sense to me is those thresholds that calculate how much of your Social Security income is taxable. Those thresholds were established in law in 1993, and they have not been adjusted since then. They're actually not indexed to inflation, like most features of our tax code are. I think a sensible reform would be to index those thresholds to inflation, and that would that would provide an additional benefit to Social Security recipients, And it would be a tax cut, but it would at least be more in line with how it would be more consistent with how we've indexed other features of our tax code. And then the other thing I'll just say on this point is, I mean, and that's what I think would be sensible, but I think it's also important not to overlook here. I mean, Social Security recipients in general receive better inflation and protection than almost anyone else in the population already because of those cost of living adjustments. So I think if if even from just like a sort of welfare standpoint, I mean, it doesn't seem that this is a group that is most necessary, is in most in need of tax relief, right now. And and I think for that reason, I think that's just another reason, in addition to the ones I cited, why I think that this is not such a great idea.
I totally agree. The way we tax Social Security benefits right now pretty much puts them on parity with the way we tax private pensions, 401ks, individual retirement accounts. Like Alex mentioned, in a traditional account, you make your deduction when you deduct your contribution, and then when you make your withdrawal, you're taxed. Or you don't get a tax benefit up front, and then you don't pay tax on the end. And that's essentially what we get with those splits of the way we treat employee contributions to Social Security versus employer contributions. So if you changed it, you'd be providing a net tax benefit to Social Security income over other types of retirement income. And that wouldn't be fair or neutral treatment. And it would worsen the solvency issues. So given all the proposals out there, from the payroll tax changes to the potential reforms to Social Security, what do you think is most critical for ensuring long-term solvency?
As I said earlier, I think the simple fix I proposed, adjusting those bend points, it's switching to price indexing for those instead of wage indexing, would largely solve this crisis. I mean, you wouldn't have to get into some of these other discussions, that they're even more politically toxic, like raising retirement ages, or figuring out like where else, where across the distribution do you adjust benefits. But the one thing I'll add, because I've talked about the scale of this issue as it relates to the funding for the program, but in terms of our federal budget, this is the largest expenditure. I mean, Social Security is the largest expenditure the government has. It is larger than our entire non-defense discretionary budget. It's just more than a fifth of the budget. So this is even beyond just the funding issue. I mean, I think it's also a conversation that policymakers have to have, which is how much government expenditures should be devoted to this transfer program. Because if it's more money being paid out to retirees, I mean, this is less money we have to spend on our younger workers. I mean, whether we do education programs for them, and then also we want to have we want to do a lot of R&D and innovation. Those are other things that the government funds, and maybe would be able to fund more of, if we had less money going to this very large transfer program.
Alex, that was very interesting, super fascinating. I'm appreciate you coming on and really giving us the full scoop in all of this. It was really, really good. I appreciate you being on. And just before we finally sign off, if you have any questions on tax, look, you know what to do. You can drop a comment on YouTube. It's very simple. You know how to do that. You can email us at podcast@taxfoundation.org, or you can slide into the DMs at DeductionPod on Twitter. Thank you for listening.